I just wanted to take a few minutes to share a little bit of my testimony about how God carried me through the darkest point of my life in the hopes that it might encourage somebody out there in the same way. You know, during the darkest times of our life, we feel like grief is just going to overwhelm us, or we're going to drown in the storms of the chaos of life, or a sudden storm particularly. And in my case, it was a sudden storm. This is my son, Anthony. This is a little tribute that we have to him. He died 7 years ago at the age of 12 after trying to perform an experiment with hanging, which I had advised him firmly not to try, and he decided to try it anyway. And he thought, well, he would do it in the safest way where his feet were touching the ground so that he would be safe. That proved obviously not to be the case. And, you know, of course, this was completely unexpected. I was just going into his room I was all excited to tell him that all the snowboards were on clearance now, and he'd been saving up his money all winter to buy one. And I walk in his room excited to tell him that, and that we were going to go shopping that afternoon for one. And I walked in his room and found him hanging from his loft bed, which was just high enough to do that from. And, you know, that's a pretty shocking thing to see for a mother to walk into her son's room and to see that. And the worst part, I think, was that my daughters, who were 14 and 16 at the time, were right behind me. And that made it even more traumatic for me and, of course, for them. But I did not want them to have to see something like that, and it was too late, they did. But, you know, I won't go into all the details about that because that's a whole nother story. But I just wanted to say that, you know, God held me up through that hardest time in my life, and particularly through the first week, and of course through months and years after, but particularly through the first week when it was the most traumatic and I was still in shock. And at the funeral, I could feel almost tangibly the arms of God holding me up. I know I would have collapsed from grief and sheer exhaustion of not sleeping, and just the whole traumatic event was so much to handle, because I just was so not expecting that. None of us were expecting that. But you know, God was with me in an amazing, tangible way. He never left me. I never felt abandoned by him. And I know sometimes some of you out there, you might be in the middle of a crisis, a sudden storm that you were not expecting, that's traumatic, and you're having to deal with it. Maybe you do feel abandoned, I don't know. I personally didn't feel abandoned by God, but I did feel like the waves of grief were just so overwhelming, and at times I felt like I would drown in those waves of grief. But God was with me, and I'm seriously telling you, I felt his tangible presence with me. I felt his arms holding me up at the funeral, or I would have collapsed. I believe I just absolutely would have collapsed. But he held me up, and it was so awesome to know that God was not just, you know, with me in some ethereal, spiritual sense. He was there the way I needed him to be there. And when you're going through your sudden storm of life, he will be there the way you need for him to be there. However that is, he'll be with you. And I wrote this poem from the way that God comforted me during that time. And I want to share it with you, and then I'll share with you also about the painting behind the poem. And this is the painting and the poem that I'm referring to. The poem I wrote, and the painting is from another woman who recently died. She had cancer, but she actually died in a car accident while she was still suffering from cancer. But I will explain a little bit of the backstory of that in a minute. But I'd like to just read this poem to you that I wrote, inspired by the way that God comforted me during my storm. And it's called Prayer in the Storm. It's hard to grasp the meaning of the sudden storms of life. 1 minute all is peaceful, and the next I'm full of strife. Dark clouds replace the warm sun. Waves of grief crash all around. Despair would pull me under till I feel like I would drown. I cry out to my Father, "Why have you forsaken me? Can't you see that I am drowning in this dark and stormy sea?" And then I hear him gently say, his voice so drenched in love, "My precious one, mistakenly you think I'm just above, but I'm in the dark sea with you. It is my arms under you. So rest and let my strong arms hold you up and bring you through." And that's exactly how I felt, that God's strong arms were holding me up and bringing me through. And I know that he'll do the same thing for you. We just have to rest. He wants us, even in our just toughest, most despairing moments, to be still and know that he is God, to rest. When you're drowning and someone comes to rescue you, the worst thing you can do is fight the rescuer. The best thing you can do is just relax back into their arms and let them pull you to safety. And that's what God wants to do. He wants to pull you to safety, but he wants you to relax and rest in his arms and trust him that he will bring you through it somehow. It doesn't always work out exactly the way that we think. I didn't have any clue that I was going to lose my 12-year-old son, but God does work everything out for good, and I believe that, and I trust him in that, and I still believe he's going to bring good out of my son's death. And my son wrote many, many poems and songs. He just loved God so much, so deeply, and you can see that in all of his poems and his writings. And now he's with his best friend, and I'm happy for him. But it's hardest for those of us left behind because we're the ones that are going through the storm. This painting of this storm actually was amazing because I had written this poem actually for an older couple up in Oregon who are actually my adopted parents. They were never able to have their own children, and so they've adopted me as their daughter, which is wonderful. Now I have 2 sets of parents. But their best friend Katie painted this painting, and she's the one that died with cancer in the car accident. But when she died, I decided to write this poem to comfort them because she was their best friend. And so I wrote this poem, and I quit like halfway through because it just wasn't coming, and it's just a simple 10-line poem, but for some reason I was really struggling with it. And I almost gave up, and I felt like God actually said, "No, don't quit. Keep going. Finish it." And so I kept working at it, and I finally finished it. I don't know why it was so hard, but I finally finished it, and I texted it to my adopted parents up in Oregon, to bring them some comfort. And a few minutes later, they texted me back this painting, which you can see is a person standing in the middle of the ocean waves. And if you can tell, it's a woman who was bald because Katie was bald from chemotherapy. And so she depicted herself in this picture as in the middle of a stormy sea, bald, crying out to God, and just, about to be overtaken by this storm in her life. So they texted me back this picture, and I was just shocked because, well, for one thing, I didn't even know Katie was an artist, but because the picture itself was precisely the poem that I had just texted them. And I thought, gosh, that is like too weird to be coincidence. So I decided to put the words and the painting together, and now I have it, as a 12 by 12 canvas displayed in my own home. And it just reminds me that, whenever we go through a storm or a tough time in life, whether it's a sudden storm or it may not be a sudden storm, but the sudden ones are really traumatic because you don't see them coming, you can't prepare for them at all. But God is with you either way. And when you feel like he's just up in heaven looking down on you saying, oh, I'm sorry you're going through that, that's terrible. He's not just up there looking down on us. He is up there. He's omnipresent, so he's everywhere. He is up in heaven, but he's also in that storm with you. And he is not going to let you go. You've got to just hang on and rest. Let his arms hold you up and rest. And let him pull you through to safety. And I believe that he will. The last line says, so rest and let my strong arms hold you up and bring you through. And I promise you, if you let him, he will do that. He loves you.